Welcome to our analysis of the frequently made mistakes for assignment 1A. First and foremost, please don't remove the to-do comments. We use those comments to quickly identify which parts of your code to review. And when you remove them, it takes us a longer time to analyze your program. Here's a mistake I saw being made in several of the new being factory methods. Do not create a new being manager. Instead, look carefully at the type of runnable threads manager and see how you can leverage it here when you call the simple being runnable method or constructor to make a new simple being runnable. Let's take a look at the run simulation method. Here's a problem I saw. This code should only block and never spin and block. So please simplify it so it just blocks. This is what I would call belt and suspenders over-engineering, because we don't need to have a wait loop that checks if the thread is alive and call join. There were a number of problems with the begin being threads method. Here's one simple example. This code works, but it's overly complicated. First and foremost, please don't use the stream factory method here. Instead, you can simply use the for each method called on mbeing threads, which is a list. So there's no need to convert the list into a stream just to call for each on it. You can call for each directly on the list. Second, please replace the use of the lambda expression with a method reference, which is more concise and easier to understand. In general, people should try to use Java 8 features such as for each loops, streams, and so on correctly in the implementation of these various methods. Here's an example where the use of a for each loop could be replaced by the for each method and a method reference. More generally, you can use a Java sequential stream from Java 8 streams in order to simplify this code even further. Here's another example of a problem in begin being threads. Note that this method is not where you're going to wait for all the other being threads to finish. That's the responsibility of the wait for beings thread method, which should be called from run simulation. So this code does not belong in begin being threads. Here's another interesting problem I saw. There were a number of variants of this. When people create new threads, they're passing the wrong information to the constructor of the thread. In this case, the code that's being passed in is a lambda expression that's simply going to call a method to set the thread to be running. Not entirely sure why that's being done, but it's unnecessary. You don't need to do that. There's more simplified ways of passing a parameter to the new thread in order to do what it needs to do. Take a careful look at what type getBeings, the getBeings factory method is returning, and use that in order to identify what to pass into the thread constructor. Here's an example that uses Java 8 streams, and it's good to use the Java 8 streams, but please try to put each of the aggregate operations on its own line in order to make the code more readable, rather than trying to cram everything onto a single line, which tends to run off the right-hand side of the page very quickly and is hard for humans to read. Likewise, if you're going to go to the trouble of using Java streams, please make sure to integrate the code shown here, which is trying to set up the uncut exception handler for each thread, into the stream itself by using the peek aggregate operation. If you have any more questions about peek or streams or aggregate operations, please feel free to come to office hours, ask questions on the Piazza discussion forum, or ask questions in class. Let's now take a look at the wait for being threads method. Here was another problem I saw a number of times in people's code. Make sure whenever you create a thread that you're actually giving it a runnable implementation, either in the form of a lambda expression or an instance of runnable or an anonymous inner class implementation of runnable, etc., in order to give the thread something to do when it started. What's happening here is we're creating a dummy thread that does nothing, and then we're starting it. So of course that's not going to get the right behavior. Moreover, if you take a look at the rest of the code, this code is then creating a thread, starting it, it does nothing, and then in the calling thread, the user interface thread, it's actually going ahead and doing the join, which is not where this should be taking place at all. Instead, the logic that's shown here, or some variant of this logic, should be taking place in the background thread, whereas here it's running in the UI thread or the calling thread where it's blocking. Moreover, and I should have also said this in the comments before, the code here needs to be rewritten to use something other than a Java for loop with a loop counter. That's very tedious and error prone. So let me add a comment that says, also, don't use a Java for loop with a counter. Instead, use the for each method. It's a cleaner way to do things. Let's take a look at another problem that I found in wait for being threads. Whenever you define a local object, a local variable in a Java method, please avoid using the M prefix. The M prefix is intended to be used just for fields, where the M stands for member, as in data member. So don't use that as the name of a local variable. Here's some other code. This code really didn't make any sense to me. I had a hard time commenting it, but basically it's doing a lot of strange things. It's somehow making a being manager. I'm not quite sure what that's there for. It's also creating a thread that does no work, because the thread that's being created is going to somehow be given no work to be done. It also looks like it's perhaps, I'm not entirely sure about this, maybe this got lowercase some other way, but this has got a number of problems in the code. And that's not how you're supposed to be implementing wait for being threads. You're also not supposed to be using the uncut exception handler in the being threads, wait for being threads method. That needs to be handled in begin being threads when the thread's created in the first place. Here's another problem. Notice that this code is running a loop, which is checking to see whether the get running being count is greater than 0. That's way, way inefficient, because it's using a spin busy wait as opposed to using a blocking join operation. So make sure you use the blocking join operation. Here's another example of creating a thread that has no code associated with it, so that's not going to work. And once again, this code is using a for each loop, and it's blocking the calling thread, in other words, the user interface thread, rather than running in a background thread. So a number of people got that wrong. So make sure that you ask questions, come to office hours to understand what is meant when you create a new thread and how you give it code to run in the background. Naturally, we'll talk more about that in class. Here's another implementation. Please avoid using a for each loop and instead use a Java 8 feature, such as a for each method and a lambda expression instead of using a for each loop. Also, please use a lambda expression when you create the new thread rather than having a runnable. That's arguable. It's not actually a bad thing to have the runnable, but because the lambda expression is nice and concise, you can put it right there instead of having to make a separate runnable. And this code here doesn't belong. The code that's showing here does not belong at this point. This code should be what's used for the caller of wait for being threads. So wait for being threads returns a thread, and then the caller, which is the run simulation method, is what should actually do the join. Let's now shift over to the simple being runnable class and take a look at some of the problems I saw there. There were a number of common problems. One common problem was to leave out an important check, which is described in the documentation, to check to see whether or not acquire Palantir returned a valid Palantir or not. So make sure you do that. Also, almost everybody who got this code wrong did this. They forgot to put the appropriate exception handling mechanism in order to ensure that even if the gaze method throws an exception, release Palantir will always be called. And so that's part of the exception handling mechanism that's available in Java. So please think about that and put the right code in here. This is a subtle problem. I had put out an earlier version of the skeleton that was not done quite the way it needed to be. So make sure you update the newest version of the skeleton. And this will be fixed when you do assignment 1B, because it will have the newer skeleton when you get it the first time. In this case, the code is calling acquire Palantir on the wrong object. It should be on the being object, in other words, on this, not on the being manager. And the reason this is important is otherwise the program won't shut down properly. It'll give a red color in the in the title bar when it finishes, because it won't have run the correct number of iterations. And then finally, several people made this mistake. This is very strange. Don't be calling run inside of acquire, palantir, and gaze. That makes no sense. You're supposed to call gaze as per the documentation. Instead, this will end up triggering some kind of infinite recursion. It certainly will do strange things. I'm not really sure what it will do, but it will not do what the code is expected to do. So those were the common problems I saw with people's solutions. Please take a careful look, watch this video, come to office hours, ask questions, post questions on Piazza, and make sure that you fix all the problems before you submit assignment 1B.